know the ranks aboard an old ship, like the captain, the first mate, or the boatswain? But what about the lowest of them all? The weakest, the most overlooked, and perhaps the most exploited. Today, we'll talk about the cabin boys, young boys who set sail not to seek adventure, but simply to survive. They were apprentices without pay, without rest, without room for error, and often without any real chance of ever returning home alive. Cabin boy was the title given to young novices beginning their lives at sea. Usually between the ages of 10 and 16, these boys were brought aboard either by necessity or obligation, with the intent of learning how to become proper sailors. But in reality, this so-called education resembled more of a survival test than any form of teaching. Many didn't even get to choose this path. Some were pushed into it by poor families, sent off by their own parents in hopes they'd at least find something to eat. Others were orphans, taken in due to tradition or desperation. And there were also those who volunteered, lured by tales of oceanic glory, only to find once they stepped on deck that the truth was nothing like the legends. A cabin boy held no formal rank and earned no wage. He was seen as a general helper, expected to jump into any task at any time of day or night. He'd often be roused before sunrise, and while others were already asleep, it wasn't uncommon for him to still be working, finishing whatever task was left undone. His chores were endless, scrubbing the decks, cleaning every corner of the ship, tending to livestock on board, hauling barrels of water or wine, delivering messages to officers, serving meals, and often being the one blamed when something went wrong. There was no formal training. Learning happened through repetition, barked orders, and when mistakes were made, punishment. Older crewmen didn't teach through patience. They taught through pressure. The rule was clear: learn fast or face the consequences. On top of all that, the environment was harsh and unforgiving. Cabin boys were surrounded by hardened adults, many violent, most distrustful, and nearly all indifferent to a boy's vulnerability. There was no space for weakness aboard. Showing fear, complaining about pain, or admitting exhaustion could be taken as insubordination. The setting itself was equally merciless. Towering masts, thick ropes, sudden storms, waves that threatened to engulf the ship at any moment, and the ever-present risk of falling into the sea, never to return. That fate was common, especially for the youngest, who were often sent to the most dangerous parts of the vessel. And yet, cabin boys were part of the very machinery that kept those ships moving across the globe. Without them, there'd be no one to handle basic tasks, no lightweight climbers for the rigging, no extra eyes scanning the seas in the dead of night. Some boys did find companionship, occasional bonds with older sailors who protected or guided them more gently. But that was the exception, not the rule. For most, the journey was marked by isolation, exhaustion, and forced adaptation. In short, the cabin boy represented the first step into maritime life, a narrow entryway into the seafaring world. But this door opened only through hardship and often through pain. In modern terms, we might call it an internship, but one without contracts, rights, limited hours, or any guarantee of returning alive. So what did daily life look like for these boys of the sea? Their day would begin before the sun had even risen. In the dark, surrounded by the creaking hull and the mix of damp wood and sweaty bodies, they'd be called, or more likely screamed at, to start working. And what followed was anything but light. First came deck cleaning, done with seawater, buckets, and crude brooms. This meant removing vomit, feces, blood, fish guts, whatever filth the crew had left behind. The ship was everyone's home, but the cabin boy was its janitor. Next came hauling barrels of water, wine, or oil. Slippery floors, loose ropes, and heavy cargo, turning each step into a risk. Then he had to serve meals to officers, always observing the rigid hierarchy of the ship. If he dropped a dish, a slap might follow. No time for apologies. Another chore, cleaning the latrines. Yes, the makeshift bathrooms tucked into ship corners, often clogged or just exposed to the open air, were also the boy's responsibility. And when a sail tore or a rope needed adjusting up the mast, the cabin boy climbed, no matter the wind, no matter how violently the ship rocked. No one cared about his delicacy. On the contrary, they expected him to be quick, silent, and invisible. Make a mistake, he'd be scolded. Take too long, he'd be punished. Complain, and he'd be replaced by someone more obedient. As for meals, there was no relief there either. Cabin boys ate last, and what remained for them was often the worst of the scraps. Potable water was incredibly scarce. Sailors often drank fermented or unsafe liquids just to stay hydrated. As for sleeping quarters, they were crammed into the ship's hold, a suffocating, pitch-black space shared with rats, cockroaches, moldy cargo, and other equally drained bodies. Even there, rest was rare. A storm or emergency could erupt at any moment, and the boy might be jolted awake by the pounding of a fist on the barrel where he slept, ordering him back on deck. The cabin boy wasn't yet a sailor, nor was he a passenger or civilian. He was something in between, a spare part, expected to fill any gap, invisible unless needed. Officers received wages, rum, and respect. The cabin boy, just a vague promise. Survive long enough, follow every order perfectly, and maybe, just maybe, one day he'd earn the right to call himself a sailor. Until then, he was disposable. Cheap labor, forced to grow up with each crashing wave, every shouted command, every slap across the face. Life on board wasn't just grueling, it was dangerous. It wasn't enough to obey immediately. There was no room for error. On ships of the Age of Discovery, discipline followed a strict, almost military structure, built on fear, brute strength, and the captain's absolute authority. The captain's word was law. Every command carried a silent warning. Disobey, and you'll be punished. Cabin boys, being the weakest and easiest to blame, often took the brunt of that punishment. A single misstep, tying a rope incorrectly, dropping something in the galley, could lead to immediate consequences. Floggings across the back were routine, often done in public with the entire crew watching, not for vengeance, but as a lesson. Lesser offenses meant receiving the palmata, hard strikes with a wooden stick on the palms, thighs, or buttocks. There were no doctors, no painkillers. Blood ran, the work continued. And if the boy got sick, that was his problem. Illness on board was seen not as misfortune, but weakness, sometimes even offense. A young boy with fever or an infected wound rarely received care. He was told to keep working. If he couldn't, he was replaced, or in harsher cases, abandoned at the nearest port and left to fate. Even on days without direct punishment, danger was ever present. Cabin boys were often the first called when the sea grew wild. Expected to climb the mainmast, they scaled soaked ropes dozens of meters high while the ship lurched violently beneath them. No harness, no safety gear. If they slipped, they crashed to the deck or vanished into the ocean. Below deck, they managed the loose cargo, barrels that during storms could roll and crush limbs. On expeditions into unknown lands, it was often the cabin boy who was sent in the small boat to approach shore, sometimes even swimming ahead to check for danger. In essence, he was the human bait, smallest and lightest, and therefore the most expendable. History didn't record the names of these boys. Many died before they even learned to navigate. They fell from masts, slipped on deck, were crushed by barrels, consumed by fever, or vanished into the night sea. And when that happened, life aboard didn't pause. Another boy took his place. Orders resumed. The sea didn't forgive, and neither did the men on board. So far, we've seen how a cabin boy's life was filled with exhaustion, danger, and physical punishment. But there was a deeper kind of suffering, one rarely written in logs or journals: sexual abuse. On ships where men were confined for months, sometimes years, without privacy, without civil laws, and with no protection for the most vulnerable, cabin boys became easy targets. They were young, isolated, voiceless, and entirely under the control of older, stronger men, some of whom lacked any moral restraint. Silence was the rule. There were no reports, no help, no defense. And even when a case reached the captain or an officer, it wasn't empathy for the victim that prompted action, but concerns over discipline, religious morality, or fear of mutiny. One of the most well-known cases happened during Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, which departed from Spain in 1519 to circumnavigate the globe. While crossing the Atlantic, a crew officer was discovered engaging in sexual acts with a cabin boy. At the time, it was labeled sodomy, and Spanish maritime law imposed a clear penalty: death. The officer was executed on board as an example. The boy's age was not recorded, but he was likely between 12 and 15 years old. What happened to him is unknown. In many similar cases, the boy was also punished, even though he was a minor, even without consent, even as a victim. According to the brutal logic of the era, any prohibited sexual act was met with punishment, regardless of age, context, or coercion. The modern concepts of abuse, exploitation, and power imbalance simply didn't exist. Back then, everything was reduced to discipline, naval honor, and Christian morality. The boy's pain was invisible. His trauma, irrelevant. Silence was mandatory. On deck, all that mattered was that the hierarchy remained intact. The ship had to keep moving. Punishment was carried out. The body discarded. The sail adjusted. For the cabin boy, it was just another day at sea. A day he survived, though maybe not entirely. Life on board was hard for everyone, but for the youngest, it bordered on impossible. Cabin boys were the invisible foundation of the great voyages. They scrubbed, hauled, climbed masts, served officers, risked their lives, and vanished from history without leaving behind a name. They were mistreated, forgotten, ignored, and yet they were there for every major maritime expedition in human history. If you appreciated this story, give it a like, because editing this took more effort than a cabin boy climbing a mast in a storm. Subscribe to the channel for more forgotten truths from the age of exploration. And let us know in the comments, would you have had the courage to be a cabin boy in the 16th century? Thanks for watching, and until the next voyage.